And do you have to go and speak to the victim and explain what's happened?
In theory, we should. We need to be making sure that we speak to that victim, whether it's in person or on the phone, or sometimes victims don't want anything to do with us. And it's always going to be a difficult conversation that where you've effectively said, look, sorry, this investigation, for whatever reason, we have run out of time. There are time limits to this investigation. We've hit that. This case cannot proceed. And that's regardless of the amount of evidence, because it's not just a case of we've got some CCTV, we've got some statements. We have to build that into an evidential case. It has to be submitted generally to the Crown Prosecution Service. They have to review that. Of course, they've had their own cuts. It's not just a case of it gets sent to the Crown Prosecution, they look at it that day. Yeah. There can be delays with that as well. Everywhere within the criminal justice system has had cuts that we all know about.
Yeah, long gone are the days where there used to be a prosecutor in each police station.
Those were great days. They worked. Prosecutors got to know police officers individually. Police officers got to see and know the prosecutors individually. You could have that first-hand advice. Now everything's sent off electronically. You don't know who's looking at it, where they're looking at it from. And it's certainly not blaming here, but everyone's had to make cuts, and it's just unfortunate that ultimately the losers in all of this are the victims and the suspects as well.
Mm.
So the case has now gone to the CPS for Kelly, and she goes to court. On this occasion, she pleads guilty at the court and receives full credit. Had she pleaded not guilty and asked you to come to court to give evidence, is that something you've done before in court?
Yeah, I've been to court quite a few times.
And how have you found that?
Personally, I found it fine. The two different cuts of the court will definitely vary, magistrates compared to Crown Court. And I think it's probably fair to say that Crown Court is a lot easier, much more professional. Generally, you're dealing with barristers, you're dealing with more serious cases. As a police officer, as an OIC, the officer in charge of the investigation, I've always felt quite proud, because there's a huge element of responsibility when I take the stand as the officer in charge of that investigation, because I'm basically saying, look, I've been in charge from the investigation from report to court, from the start right to the end. Everything that's happened is my responsibility, pros and cons. And the very fact it's got to this stage at court would suggest that there's a good chance that this person is responsible and there's a realistic prospect of conviction. And from my point of view as an OIC, I could say, well, actually, that's down to me. Now, sometimes it might be, well, actually, it's not really, because I've just taken statements from the people who actually saw it or did it and that sort of thing. But I've collated it all. And I think there can be some police officers see court as being really scary. It's not.
I mean, that's the role of sat in interviews where the police officers explain that their job is as a fact finder and evidence gatherer. And from what you said there, that is the role of a police officer, is finding which suspects to speak or which witnesses to speak to, what evidence to gather, and putting that together.
Yeah, and ultimately it would be down to the court to make that decision. So if in this case, if it's gone to trial, I'm just simply going to provide the information. I don't get to say that I think this person is guilty, but I provide that information, and that might suggest this person is, but ultimately the courts, the jury, they're going to make that decision.
But that's interesting that you were talking earlier about the importance of having confidence in your position as a police officer when we were talking about perhaps being around unsympathetic people in a hospital, for example, in a waiting room. Because I think that for most people, the idea of being cross-examined in a courtroom would fill you with a certain amount of, if not fear, trepidation. Yeah. But I think, it seems like what you're saying is you go back to those first principles of, as James was saying, acting as a fact finder and almost in a neutral position, which is interesting to hear.
Yeah, and to be honest, if there are nerves or worries, then sometimes that's a good thing. It's the same, to put it into a sporting context. If someone, you're about to go out, that's David Beckham. He's about to go out on the pitch at Wembley. At the time, he was one of the best footballers in the world. I'm quite sure he was probably nervous. Did he play rubbish? No, he's one of the best people in the world. So it's no different to police officers that you might be worried or concerned because actually you've got vested interests. You might have spent months, sometimes years, investigating this case. You've seen the impact that it's had on the victim, for example, in certain cases, and you know what could happen if this person doesn't get convicted, how the impact that that victim might have. And so therefore it's not necessarily about what you've done, it's about what others have done. And yeah, I think that can sometimes weigh on people's minds, but it's not, sometimes again, police officers might worry about what they did or didn't do in an investigation that might be criticised. Generally, by the time you get to trial, those things have already been worked out and understood, and they've been covered one way or the other. So these days, the way things are dealt with between the prosecution and defence, these things are generally highlighted fairly early on in procedures, or proceedings rather. So there's not too many surprises that come out in trials these days.
For you, what would make a shift satisfying?
Finishing on time and going home safely.
Very good.
I think that's what I tend to say at the start of our shifts. Let's make sure we keep each other safe, finish on time. It doesn't always happen, but you just need to look at there's only cases that hit the press about the worst things in life. But from a police officer's perspective, there are many police officers on a daily basis getting assaulted for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, it is a job. Police officers join the police. They earn money, and most of them will want to go home to their families safe and well. And as long as they can do that, it's fine. And when they don't, that's when there's problems.
And if we turn to the press and policing, if you don't mind us talking to you about this, it's been reported in the news quite a lot recently about police officers that are acting outside of their duty, and the public's perception around policing. As a police officer who is still on duty, have you felt the public's perception changing towards police officers?
Face to face, no. Online, yes, because it's easy to say things online, isn't it? I think the public generally know that the vast, huge proportion of police officers do a good job and do a good job well. And every police officer who's doing that good job feels sickened when one of our own let us down, as has been reported. Sometimes there can be this perception that the police, there's too much going on, there's lots of bad stuff going on, it's all to do with police officers. Well, it's easy for me to say that's not the case, because it clearly is the case when you see in the news that there are police officers who are getting charged with doing some serious crimes. But there's an expression about perception is reality. So sometimes if people are perceiving that, well, does that say, at the very least, we need to be having a look at that. And that is being done by police forces all over the country, that we are taking a look at a lot closely at our own. And don't forget, when police officers are being charged with horrendous and serious crimes, who's actually putting them to court in the first place? Other police officers, the good police officers. So what I wouldn't want is for these isolated ones, and they are isolated, to not, don't forget about all the people who are working hard to get these people locked up in the first place.
I was listening to a podcast not that long ago, and in it they interviewed somebody who had been a police officer, and he spoke about some of the challenges that can bring when you have to bring charges against your colleague, or even report a colleague, because as I think a lot of people are now aware, there are instances, as you say, they are very rare, where there's a pattern of behaviour in that individual that when you look at it, in hindsight, or when it's published for the general public to look at, the question is, why wasn't this sort of found or seen before? And one response that I heard this ex-police officer give was that it's so damaging to the idea of the team, and you fear that if you were to make such a report and then you needed backup, and that person that you required backup from was the person that you had made a report about, it's almost a disincentive.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think I can understand how that might have been the case in days gone by, but I think these days we've got more procedures in place within forces for officers to actually report other officers. So police officers are being given the tools to do this. They're becoming more and more confident, and those days of old where you wouldn't do it because you were scared, I think they are becoming less. Don't get me wrong, if someone's working in a team and they're working with these people day in, day out, yes, there might be some that are reluctant to report that because of the impact you may directly have on them and the team. But I think it's becoming more and more common. People are being told to feel confident and be confident with reporting. Because at the end of the day, if I'm, as a police officer, if I see something going on and hear about something going on involving a colleague, well, I don't want that person to be a police officer if they're doing something. If they need education, if they need learning about knowing what is right and wrong, they should already know this. But knowing where that line is, where the boundaries are, we don't want that sort of behaviour. Police officers are meant to be professionals. It's only right that we should have higher standards than ordinary members of the public. That's what the public expect of us. So we should look to uphold those morals, that behaviour. And if it's not to those high standards, then it should be called out. And I think the very fact that cases are being reported in the press more and more show that these cases are being, people are calling them out and they are being dealt with. And it's one of those ones, it depends on how you look at it. Can you say, well, look, there's police officers in the news all the time? Okay, well, is that maybe police officers have been previously, but it hasn't been reported. Now it's getting more of a focal interest. And are people being more and more confident to call out bad behaviour and get it dealt with?
In terms of the police station itself, as a defence solicitor, all we see is the front office and interview rooms. Is there a canteen? Is there somewhere where the police officers hang out and have a chat about cases and what they've done that day?
If only. No, there are very few places that have canteens anymore. When I first joined, most stations would have a canteen. They don't exist anymore, really. It's not massively different from anywhere else in your office here, for example. I'd imagine if you wanted some lunch, you probably haven't got a canteen, you nip out. Same as police officers, but some members of the public don't think that police officers should have a break and be able to nip out to get a sandwich and the like. But yeah, so don't have canteens, probably because we're getting more and more different departments in, and therefore places that were canteens are now offices. They've been changed. Each department would generally have their own workstation. The nature of policing means that a lot of it is remote working, so people tend not to have their own desks anymore. It's a bit, whoever turns up first gets a certain desk, so you've got this sort of clean office, which there's pros and cons with that. I remember in days gone by, you could set up your own desk and that would be your desk. You'd have pictures on there, you'd have your own mats, books, whatever it is, whereas now everything's in a locker, cleared away, ready for somebody else to come and have that. So, but I think that's probably the same with most places these days.
In terms of law changes, how do you, as a police force, keep up with law changes, such as if a drug was to be made illegal?
Whenever there are specific law changes, there's generally information that gets sent out on the force. Depending what it is, would mean that we might need to do more training. A lot of training these days is done online. Now, there's pros and cons with that. I've worked within training before, and I can understand both the pros and cons. There's a lot of e-learning that comes out, and I think generally for office-based people where they're not responding to the 999 calls, they can fit in this online training. The difficulty is that when you've got response officers, generally response PCs, they're responding to 999 calls all the time, 24/7, shifts of early shifts, late shifts, night shifts. It becomes very, very difficult to fit in this training in between those shifts, and it generally tends to be halfway through a night shift when, of course, you're tired and you don't really want to be doing training anyway. But if there are changes, that tends to be publicised, and it's about staying professionally up to date, really.
So thank you so much. We've been recording with Iain Watkinson, who's an acting inspector, and it's been great. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Iain. Thanks for coming in.
No worries, you're very welcome.